Hey, folks, and welcome to Israel Explained. Today, we're going to talk about some of the tensions between the government and the IDF that are threatening to derail the war effort. Um, we've seen a lot of these tensions in public statements, mostly by the government, or I should say, mostly by errant ministers, not official government releases, and in leaks from cabinet meetings. But yesterday's cabinet meeting reached a new level of escalation. If Israel's lucky, that was a very ugly meeting that we will move past. And if Israel's not lucky, it signals a real fraying of civil military relations that will undermine the whole operation. So let's look at what happened. IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi and several other commanders in the IDF went to the Security Cabinet meeting last night and were attacked more viciously than they ever had been before on several fronts regarding several topics. For example, Miri Regev, a Likud minister, attacked the IDF for making a big hoopla out of finding a massive tunnel the other day. Now, if you remember, the IDF found the biggest tunnel system it had found yet, close to Erez Crossing, large enough that you could actually drive cars in there, and showed it in videos. Regev said, "Why are we celebrating that? Uh, why are we happy we found a tunnel? What happened while we were sleeping? There's a movie like that, While You Were Sleeping," she added helpfully. And indeed, that movie stars Sandra Bullock and Bill Pullman and has a 6.8 rating on IMDb. So it's only recommended for romantic comedy fanatics. Regev and Ben-Gvir also grilled Halevi about the soldiers who filmed themselves praying Jewish prayers in a mosque in the West Bank, and said that they should not be removed to the military. She was told by Toledano, the head of strategy at the Central Command, that this is in the authority and responsibility of the IDF. Ben-Gvir replied, "Yeah, we've heard about your responsibility." Quite sarcastically, of course, to which Bibi said, "Enough, we got an answer." Netanyahu later left the meeting to get an important message or something like that, and Ben-Gvir used the opportunity to tell the chief of staff there will be hell to pay if they are removed. To which Halevi said, "I command the army, and I will decide our code of conduct. It's not a matter for the cabinet, and don't threaten me." End quote. Which was one of several moments where Halevi defended himself, but it was the fiercest moment where Halevi defended himself, and enough for Ben-Gvir to shut up, which is very difficult to do. According to another leak, an unnamed cabinet member said, quote, "When will we see real achievements, like killing the heads of Hamas and the leadership?" To which Halevi replied, "That takes time. It took 10 years to get bin Laden. It won't take us that long." Justice Minister Yariv Levin, who's been very quiet during this war so far, said, "We went into Gaza for it to take 10 years." And Regev added, "Who will be here in 10 years?" Hopefully, everyone will be here in 10 years. We can only hope. In another leak, Regev, who was incredibly active in this, even suggested that Israel starve the civilians in the Gaza Strip. The Attorney General noted that that would be a war crime. In one dramatic moment, Benny Gantz felt that the chief of staff had had enough. He put his arm on Halevi's shoulder in a show of support. Yifat Shasha Biton of his party told Ben-Gvir to lay off of Halevi in another moment, to which he replied, "Ma'am, don't tell me what to do." And she replied, "Don't call me ma'am." So the tensions are not only between the government and the military, but also between Gantz's party and the Likud and Ben-Gvir on one hand, but also there's a lot of tension between the Likud and Ben-Gvir. So we'll talk a little about the cracks inside the cabinet in another episode because a lot is happening there. So what does this all mean? I wouldn't be talking about this if this was just mean words from one person to another. Who cares? Right? Israelis say mean things all the time. But there's a lot going on here beneath the surface, or not so much beneath the surface. It's hard to escape the feeling that the government, the ministers in the government, are trying to turn the IDF into scapegoats for the failures of October 7th. They will try to say when elections come, when people say that they should go home, that the army was run by left wingers, those left wingers failed, right wingers need to appoint more right wingers to hold these positions, and that would stop that from happening again. In order to frame it this way, the government is, or these members of the government are lying about what happened. You see, in Israel, the government tells the IDF what to do. The IDF can object, the IDF can say what you're doing is wrong, but ultimately they have to obey. Every single thing that the IDF did leading up to the war was at the behest and command of the civilian leadership. That doesn't mean the IDF is absolved of responsibility. They have a ton of responsibility. But as Truman said, the buck stops here. It ultimately stops with the government. And we can even give very concrete examples from this cabinet meeting. For example, Regev talked about the tunnel near the Erez crossing and said, how did this happen while you were sleeping? But in reality, the IDF has been aware of this tunnel for several years. Not necessarily its exact location or depth, but aware of its existence and its general location. It bombed it on two occasions, once causing very severe damage to it, which was then reconstructed. But they also told Netanyahu that in order to destroy the tunnel, Israel would have to go in. The IDF would have to go in to the area. And for his own reasons, Netanyahu did not want to do that. So ultimately, this is the responsibility of the government. Now, the highly detailed leaks here, more detailed than usual, tell you that this is a public campaign to try to make a specific point. That specific point is that the government is showing that the IDF is responsible for the collapse, and the IDF is not being hard enough on the enemy, and therefore the leadership hasn't been killed yet. There haven't been enough achievements. Soldiers are being suspended. The IDF is not starving the population, and all of those things. The fact that Miri Regev is mentioned so many times in all the leaks is, in my opinion, pretty close to proof that she's behind a lot of these leaks. We've seen other times when uh, other politicians would benefit from the leaks made, and it's usually a Occam's razor, the member of the government who would stand to have the most to gain from the leaks is the one that is behind those leaks. It's certainly not the IDF, because having these kind of arguments with the government does not suit the IDF's needs in any way. It's worth pointing out that Netanyahu did not engage in this sort of blaming in the cabinet meeting. That's not to say that he's not trying to blame the IDF for his own shortcomings. It's just that he's smart enough to understand that right now, showing unity with the IDF in a moment of war is good for his credibility and for his attempted political rehabilitation. He may be using hatchet men or women like Miri Regev to achieve his goals behind the scenes. But he notably told people to stop attacking Halevi in the meeting. Meanwhile, Gallant, the defense minister, released a statement saying that he, quote, supports the chief of staff against irresponsible politicians. And that is him actually coming out against members of his own party. Because, as we said, Miri Regev is the clearest person involved in the attacks against the military in this particular meeting, although Ben-Gvir and others have been more outspoken in other cases. So those are two things that we really need to look at as this war continues. Are relations between the government and the IDF deteriorating? And is the center holding in the coalition itself, in the cabinet itself, when we see these inner fights between the politicians. Both are important, but I would say that civil military relations are more important. If the IDF feels that it can't rely on the government for backing, that it can't bring up security issues in front of the government, that will have serious ramifications for the ability of the government to run the war. There needs to be some kind of basic trust. The military needs to bring information to the government. The government needs to use that information as the basis for planning their strategy. If there's no trust between the two, information might not go up and commands might not be followed. Clausewitz talked about how in order to win a war, you have a triangle that needs to be in harmony, and that's society, and that's army, and that's the government. And these things bring that entire triangle out of whack because it's not only that the government is attacking the IDF, it's that the followers of the government, the Likud voters, the Ben-Gvir voters, are increasingly getting the sense that anything that's gone wrong with the country, anything that's going wrong with the country, is because of the IDF. And that's Hamas's dream that Israelis stop supporting the IDF. Doesn't matter why, because they're not right wing enough, because they're too right wing, as long as there are fractures in Israeli society. The government and the military have to be in sync in order for this operation to succeed. This kind of thing cannot continue. Okay, so after that, let's answer some questions. Friend of the show, Am Yisrael Chai, asks, how realistic is it for Israel to make a, quote, humanitarian tent city in the agricultural parts of Gaza and to send aid there? Well, right now, it's not particularly realistic. And when I say right now, I mean today, because there are two points of entry into Gaza right now. Those are Kerem Shalom and the Rafah crossing. Both of them are deep in the south. And Tzahal, the IDF, doesn't have control in that area yet. But once Khan Yunis is taken, at least superficially, Israel can't expand its hold. And this ties into another question that I received. So why don't I just answer them both? John Price also asked, do you think that Israel will move to Rafah by February? If yes, will the Gazans be directed to the central Gaza Strip? So I'll unite those two things. I don't know what the next move for the IDF is. But after Khan Yunis, you have to expect that they will move both north and south. North because they skipped the area between Khan Yunis and Gaza City. But south because A, there's terrorists there, and B, because of what you were asking in that question, because of the aid. Right now, aid is being distributed, and every time aid is being distributed, Hamas is increasing the share that it's taking. Honestly, right now, at this point, and I'm a supporter of the aid for diplomatic reasons and humanitarian reasons, the humanitarian aid is kind of self-defeating. It's a lot of it's going to Hamas, and that's stopping Hamas from surrendering and stopping Hamas from releasing hostages. The IDF is aware of that. So, since humanitarian aid needs to be distributed for retaining American support and for helping the population, they will want to create a contiguous area from Khan Yunis to Kerem Shalom or from Khan Yunis into Rafah in order to be able to distribute aid. As part of the latest hostage offer, which I didn't talk about today because it's not yet concrete, Israel volunteered to create exactly what you were talking about, humanitarian areas where it will distribute aid. That means, in my opinion, knowing how Israel operates, that Israel will end up doing that anyway, whether it's part of the hostage deal or not, because it's in its interests. So I don't think we're too far away from doing that. The only thing stopping it right now is Israel expanding its toehold into the Rafah area, into the Kerem Shalom area. I've heard some reports that Israel doesn't want to go into Rafah because it will create some incidents with the Egyptians, etc. I don't know, but Israel will get close enough to Rafah to probably make this possible. The other question asked if this will happen by February. Yes, absolutely. Israel doesn't have an unlimited timeline to expand its presence in Gaza. So what it's going to start doing in January, I think, is it's going to be expanding its hold geographically in a more shallow way, like I already said, taking over areas to kind of piss on it to show that it's theirs when the next phase starts, so Israel can already be there and then start to move closer to purify. I think that'll all happen in January. So in January, Israel will probably have either Rafah or Kerem Shalom, or possibly both, do that. That'll be great for everyone because then Israel can distribute aid, the population can get it, and it deprives Hamas of supplies, and it increases the wedge between Hamas and the population. So that will happen. Friend of the show, close personal friend of mine, Syra, asks, what do you think are the chances of Israel accepting a two-state solution? This war has further highlighted the need for a two-state solution. Any political settlement after the war requires concessions from both sides, and it seems there is more international and regional pressure on Israel to accept the two-state solution. Well, thank you, Syra. I think there is actually more chance now of a two-state solution than there has been in many years. Not a popular or common answer, but the logic behind that is simple. Up until now, the West Bank and Gaza have been controlled by different governments. Israel not only wasn't challenging that, but was encouraging that in order for it not to have to pursue a two-state solution. That was the Netanyahu doctrine. Well, that's over. Even if Israel manages to officially keep the PA out of Gaza, Gaza will have a government that is affiliated with the PA one way or another, that doesn't have strong independence, that will be easily brought into a union with the West Bank. Israel will also have the opportunity, the international community will have the opportunity to create an education system that doesn't poison against Israel. That will, A, make terrorism more likely in the far future, but still, and B, take away one of Israel's excuses not to allow for a two-state solution. And the pressure now is immense because the United States knows it can't get support from any other country for continuing to arm Israel if Israel doesn't accept a two-state solution. So there'll be a lot of arm twisting to force Israel to do that. And with Netanyahu now being politically neutered, or possibly politically neutered, the next prime minister is likely to be Gantz, and Gantz is more amenable to a two-state solution. And with Hamas gone, that removes, in my opinion, the biggest barrier to a two-state solution. The next barrier is the settlements, and that's a whole other difficult issue. So a two-state solution still seems very far. The chances are still low, but this war actually makes the chances higher. And I hope that we see progress in that direction. Jario Super asks, if the opinion polls are accurate and support for Israel has sustained, like I said in the last episode, why do you think more Western governments are starting to call for Israel to roll down its offensive with wider talks of ceasefire? Where is this pressure coming from that is making the US government support waver? Or is it likely the US is saying one thing for US citizens in the upcoming election and another thing behind closed door to the Israelis, giving them more freedom and flexibility? Or do you see the US ramping up demands to put an end to the fighting over the next few weeks? Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. Great question. So first of all, let's look at public opinion. I said that more people are supporting Israel than Hamas, but that doesn't mean that they don't want a ceasefire. So I think there's a lot of people, maybe the plurality in most countries, that say Hamas are terrorists. Israel was right to defend itself, but Israel's using too much force, and a ceasefire needs to happen now because too many Palestinians are being killed. I think that's the sort of common sense, normal reaction of Western people who are not like fanatically right wing or fanatically left wing. I think that's where most people are. So there's no contradiction between saying you're for Israel and saying you're for a ceasefire. Those of us who um, know the conflict better understand that a ceasefire right now would be a disaster for Israel. But for most people, the idea that war will stop sounds good. It's just a natural thing that sounds good. It's very hard to convince people, oh, Israel needs to keep attacking because that will mean the death of more Palestinians. Most people are really not convinced by that. As for why the US is ramping up pressure, part of it is what I just said. Another part of it is getting the support of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, all the Arab nations, without whom it's hard to create a new government in Gaza. It's hard to create a coalition against the Houthis. It's hard to support the rebuilding of Gaza. The US needs those countries. And you know what? Israel needs those countries too. And that's where a lot of this pressure is coming from. So you asked, will the US be ramping up demands? Yes, absolutely. There will be more pressure in January than in December. The US has basically given Israel a freebie in December. It feels like it's being quite generous. It's going to allow Israel to do whatever it wants over Christmas. But January is going to be a different story. People will be paying more attention. Israel will have had more time to do things. Things are going to get trickier and dicier for all the reasons that I mentioned. Okay, last question. Close personal friend, friend of the show, Bimaya. She asks, what are the nationalities of the remaining hostages? And other questions. I'll answer that first. So there's 113 hostages believed to be alive. 103 of them are Israelis or dual nationals with French passports, American passports, that kind of thing. 8 are Thai, 1 is Nepali, and 1 is French Mexican. So that's the nationalities. She also asks, as the U.S. attempts to gather international support to protect shipping routes, what is being done to return international hostages home? That's a good question. All of the governments that are involved in having hostages taken have been in some sorts of talks through Qatar and Egypt. The 8 Thai that remain, they might not be accounted for because the Thai government has gotten most of those released in a deal. Um, the I know that Macron is trying to get the French citizens out. The U.S. is trying to get the Americans out. Nepal, I've heard a little bit, is trying to get their citizens out. But Israel and the United States also feel responsible for them and have been doing their best. As we know, a Tanzanian was brutally killed by Hamas. The whole thing was recorded, and it's horrifying. So it could just be that the remaining international hostages are dead, or some of them are dead, or some of them can't be located. But there has been pressure to release them. Vimaya continues, I'm personally enraged at the willingness of the US and others to step up military involvement to protect the ability to sell stuff, but not to protect and return innocent civilian hostages. Well, that's perfectly understandable, but Israel does not want the US to intervene militarily in Gaza. I don't know if the US has offered to do that in order to get hostages. It has had flights and used intelligence to try to locate the hostages, and Israel's appreciated that. But what it hasn't done is used military to try to release them. Um, A, there's no reason to assume their military would do better than the IDF. B, Israel has traditionally not farmed out its security needs to other actors, even to the United States. If it ever did so, it would be considered a very serious sign of weakness and dependence. So that's probably one of the main reasons it's doing that. Meanwhile, the operation in the Red Sea is one that is not an immediate Israeli security issue, although it's related. It's one that's out of Israeli territorial waters, and it's one the US is far better equipped to deal with because it has the largest navy in the world. So it's not exactly the way you're setting it up. It's not so much that the US is not willing to do one thing and is willing to do the other. It's more that there's a division of labor between Israel and the United States that both sides are comfortable with. Okay, so that's the end of this episode. Couple things I want to mention. First, if you're watching this and don't know, I have a podcast called The History of the Land of Israel. I'll be releasing a new episode today, and that comes out every 2 weeks. I cover the history of the land of Israel from the creation of the planet Earth up until today. Right now, I'm in the late Bronze Age, beginning the Iron Age, so I'm building my way up. I also started a Patreon today. So if you want to support this work and the work from my other podcast, I'll also be releasing exclusive content through my Patreon. Then go to that and contribute. Also consider following me on Twitter. And I will see you tomorrow in the next episode of Israel Explained.